This is the third in our 2024 quarterly speaker series, and it has served as a wonderful forum for highlighting the ideas and leadership of innovators and thought leaders across our civic and democracy space in America. And tonight, this afternoon, actually, I am really thrilled to talk with Hilary Braseth, the Executive Director of OpenSecrets. We work with the data at OpenSecrets at American Promise all the time. I can't imagine how difficult it would be to know even as much of the story as we know about big money in American politics, even as much of it remains dark money, as we know, and we'll talk about that as well. We'll discuss how OpenSecrets collects and presents data, the challenges about that, the impact of their groundbreaking reporting on public awareness and policy making. And as I said, at American Promise, we need that data because we are doing something big. We're uniting Americans to fix the number one solvable problem, the corruption of this out-of-control money in elections. And we've made huge progress. Our work in driving a constitutional solution to the problem to restore the power of Americans to have limits on how money is used to influence elections. We have won in 22 states and recently passed the Pennsylvania House and many other states, vying for number 23 and 24, as that drives support to the 2/3 vote in Congress that we're going to need. We've been at it. It's no easy task, but many of you have been in this work, and you know that we are reaching a tipping point in this country where our success is coming for the 4 Freedom Amendments passage and ratification. If you don't believe it, look at the data. If you could also just talk to Americans about this. Money in politics is now at the top of priorities. Pew Research Center released a recent survey of the top priorities that Americans want addressed now. And in the top 3, 65% of Democrats, 60% of Republicans say reducing the influence of money in politics should be a top priority for the incoming president and Congress. It's third only to the economy and defending against terrorism. It's higher than immigration, climate, crime, budget, you name it, because Americans know this is an existential crisis with the power of and corrupting influence of money in politics, addressing all of those other issues and making them harder to solve. So tonight's conversation could not be more timely as we go through another multi-billion-dollar election cycle. OpenSecrets is the nation's premier research group tracking money in U.S. politics and its effect on elections and public policy. We had Hilary Braseth, the executive director there at OpenSecrets, at our National Citizen Leadership Conference in Washington, and those of us who were there to hear her know we're in for a treat tonight. She brings a wealth of experience to her position. Prior to joining OpenSecrets, she worked at IDEO in Silicon Valley, served as a public service fellow at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, the co-founder of 2 groundbreaking initiatives, Dare to Innovate, a youth entrepreneurship incubator in West Africa, and OZE, if I'm pronouncing that right, Africa's first mobile business insights platform. Hilary, welcome to the American Promise Leadership Series conversation. We're thrilled to have you here. Tell us a little bit about OpenSecrets and what brought you from Africa, Silicon Valley, Cambridge, and the JFK School to take on the leadership of OpenSecrets.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, so much. And thanks to everybody for being with us here. It's a joy to get a chance to be with your community again. I so enjoyed my time at the conference a few months ago. But just for those of you who don't have an awareness of what OpenSecrets is and a bit of our origin story, which isn't something that many people often know, we've actually been around for the better part of 40 years. And our origin story dates back to when 2 senators, one Republican, one Democrat, were already in the 80s and 90s seeing a growing trend of the influence of money in politics. And so they started to, by a painstaking process, gather those data points, and they compiled them into a book that was about 3 inches thick and 1,500 pages long, and it was entitled OpenSecrets. And this volume, there was a publication every so often, and the volume lived at the library. So folks could go and look up, any piece of information around money and politics related to their member of Congress, to lobbying information. And so that, of course, evolved over time. And when the birth of the internet happened in the 90s, we had a very rudimentary but functional website that started to digitize all of this data. And eventually that continued to evolve into where we are today, where we now have compiled data sets spanning all kinds of different entities spanning money and politics. So we have contributions data at both the federal and the state level. We're the only entity that has that information at those varying levels of influence. And we also have lobbying data. What are company trends? Who are they lobbying specifically? What lobbyists are they hiring? We track industry trends. So you can see spikes based on when, for example, there's been more conversation around AI. We see a spike in the data. And then we also do dark money analysis, as Jeff mentioned, or donations that are a bit more opaque, as well as other sort of big picture analyses. During election season, we calculate the total cost of the election. We also do analyses around, did money win? So all that to say, we have a pretty significantly deep legacy as pulling all of this data together into one single place to access. And so my foray into this space is, I began in January as executive director, and my background has largely been in product development and thinking about what might a user need to see in order to engage more fully with a company, with an organization, with a project. And so with that background of having spanned the private and public sector, I'm super excited to be with OpenSecrets. We have a very impressive tenure and expertise on the team. A lot of folks have been on the team for 10 plus years. So there's a lot of institutional memory and also memory of the history of the trend of money and politics in the United States. And so it's really an exciting moment. There's a lot of projects already underway that I'll be able to share more about in this conversation that we're super excited about to make our data even more easy to understand and engage with.
Fantastic. And when we talked and you spoke at our conference, you talked about how important it was to make the case for transparency. And I'm quoting, and particularly in this moment where truth, trust, and facts are challenged. How does OpenSecrets build trust with your audience?
It's such a good question, Jeff. And it's one that I often hear too, just having conversations with, folks in the space, is this question around not only whether or not facts are real, but also, does transparency matter? And I know you and I have had a sidebar on this as well, of folks wondering, does more transparency actually erode trust? And I'm a firm believer that the antithesis is true. We have to have transparency in order to build trust, especially with the trend of technology. I think younger generations increasingly demand transparency and require it to build trust. So I think by virtue of what we do, we provide very straightforward data, very straightforward analysis that's nonpartisan, independent, and nonprofit. And so for us, the trust building happens in being able to regularly update those numbers without even, unlike a journalist, even, we don't provide a way necessarily to interpret that data other than the actual trend itself. So there's no partisan angle that we lend to those numbers. It's just the facts. And so that history, our legacy of being around for about 4 decades, being unbiased, nonpartisan. I like to say we share dirt on both sides of the aisle. So there's not favoritism at all. And we also show transparency around our donors. It's really important that we also practice what we preach. And so I think all of those elements help put us in a position where not only are we seeing journalists use our data and organizations like you all, but we also see your average citizen who increasingly, I think, is interested in going to the primary source. They want to and are more familiar increasingly with using the data themselves. And so, for example, on our website, we have a little hidden area where we show what trending searches are. And in the wake of, even the assassination attempts a few weeks ago, the name of that potential, that assassin was trending in the top 5 searches on our website. So to me, that is evident that people, when something happens out in the world, they want to come to our site and they want to know what the history is, because often if you follow the money, you can start to put together more of a story and connect the dots for why and how things happen out in the world.
Amazing. Let's talk about the data, because, since the Supreme Court and Citizens United and other cases ruled that McCain-Feingold, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, and then many other laws that limited money, particularly from independent sources, i.e. not the campaigns, violated the First Amendment. We have seen sort of the metastasizing of money and where it comes from, where it's spent. So not just from campaigns, but in super PACs or LLCs or C4s or many different entities now having millions and in the aggregate billions of money, billions of dollars moving through them, influencing the outcome of elections. How do you track all that data? Where do you get it? How do you, when it's not any longer just the official campaign contributions, but all these different sources of spenders, how do you stay on top of it?
Yeah, also a great question, Jeff. We have a great number of folks on staff who've been pulling this data for quite some time. And so the majority of our federal data actually comes from the FEC, the Federal Election Commission. And when we first started out, the FEC's data was largely inaccessible. And so OpenSecrets was the only way to realistically ingest and interpret and understand what that data was. I've had one reporter let me know that our work has actually pushed the FEC to enhance their usability. Whether or not that's true, I can't say, but the FEC also has gotten a lot better in web design and user interface design. But what's different is that OpenSecrets has all of the federal data dating back to, again, the 90s. And so, we don't delete that data. That's always accessible. So it's helpful to better dig into those trends of what's been happening over the last several decades. So most of the federal data comes from the FEC, and we get the state level data from all 50 states. So this dates back to one of our predecessor organizations had started out on the West Coast and had built a way to ingest every single state's campaign contribution filings. And if a state has disclosure around lobbying, the same goes for that data set as well. And so it is not an easy process. Every jurisdiction is different, and it ranges on the spectrum from states that have very little disclosure laws and file using paper. And our team has to, by hand, ingest that information and make sure that it's inputted correctly into our database, to the opposite end of the spectrum where it's very highly digitized and it's much easier for our team to ingest. So it's a myriad of different processes. We also have team members who collect data around foreign influence numbers and lobbying registrations as well as lobbying spending. And then once all of the data comes in, so we're in the midst of processing at least one download from a few days ago, we do a lot of painstaking work to make sure that the data is cleaned, that it's integrated, and also that it's what we call entity resolved or entity resolution process, which allows us, again, to make sure that because of the amount of historical data we have, that we're able to link up records when it's involving the same donor, for example. So we have a pretty robust system in trying to identify, is Jeff Clements, who lives in Massachusetts, who gave $20 to this candidate or $200 to this candidate, the same as the Jeff Clements who maybe 8 years ago lived in Idaho. I'm not sure you ever lived in Idaho, Jeff, but just, trying to make sure whether or not that's the same donor so that we can resolve that as a single source of money in those instances where it is applicable. So we do a lot of work with the data once it's in.
Yeah, so you talked about the $20 donor, which many of us are not that worried about compared to the $125 million donor, or as I found a few minutes ago when I was on the OpenSecrets website, a donor that is giving to a super PAC in tens of millions of dollars level that is called, the super PAC is Future Forward. And then there's Future Forward Action, which OpenSecrets has dug all the data up so you can see all the donors to Future Forward, but then you see one of these donors is called Future Forward Action, and you can't really see beyond that. And they're on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, you see the same thing with Senate Leadership Fund, a super PAC. You've got all the donors, and you can see billionaires and all the other donors. And then you see a donor called One Nation, which whatever that is, right? And you can't go further. Are there, those are examples of what's called dark money that people talk about, where you just don't know where that money's coming from. Can you describe what that's where that dark money comes from? Like, why can't you dig in and find out, like, who are the donors to One Nation or Future Forward Action? Or are there other areas where you know money's being spent and you just can't get to the bottom of where it's coming from?
Yeah, such a good question. And this is in some instances what we would call dark money, which the disclosure law is definitely imperfect. And there are instances where a super PAC might have donors that don't have a source of that donation. And that's relative to, again, that disclosure law being imperfect. And so in those instances, we have researchers on staff who will do what we like to call shoe leather research, which I like to envision the painstaking process of making shoe leather clean, for example. And so we have investigative journalists who will try to dive into the registration of what we would call a dark money group to see if we can locate a location for that entity or any other information on the web based on who might be donors supporting those groups. And so on a case-by-case basis, we will do a deep dive analysis on those figures. And we also have a big portion of our website devoted to educating and teaching about dark money writ large. Other sort of more complex figures for us to dive into in terms of the source of funding is there are such things as non-searchable or non-scrapable PDFs. So as I mentioned earlier, in the case of a state that has not great disclosure law, they might upload those filings in a PDF format. And that just is harder for us to scrape. And it's more of a manual process that requires a lot more time and effort and energy. Similarly, some things are handwritten. It depends on, the nature of the document. The other thing that's difficult for us to dive into sometimes are online ads data. So that's a phenomenon that's, exploded onto the scene where different campaigns and also outside spending is contracting to have different advertisements show up on Facebook or Instagram, X, formerly known as Twitter. And so in those instances too, that's also a painstaking process for us to better understand who might have paid for that ad, because there are a few layers of complexity that we have to dig through to get to that source. So that's actually a project that we are actively working on right now with a partner in academia.
Great. And you've done some reporting, and as have we. I commend folks to the American Promise report on foreign money in American elections. It got quite a bit of attention and was actually cited by two members of Congress, bipartisan members of Congress, introducing a bill to try to address foreign money. We've seen foreign governments, foreign entities running money through various levels of these different entities, LLCs, C4s, till no matter what kind of disclosure you could get, it's hard to trace the original source. How is foreign money coming into American elections right now, and how much can you track that, and what can OpenSecrets do to explain that data a little bit more, if anything?
Yeah, we do have a section of our site that dives into that. And I'm going to send a link in the chat if anyone wants to do a deeper dive. And you can toggle by year, but we've done case studies across states because it's also been reported that foreign money is also going in at the state level, which again is harder to track by virtue of every state having a different set of filing procedures. We also track foreign influence and based on lobbying activity. So we have a section of our site that also tracks what are the top nations that are influencing policy writ large by virtue of lobbying activity, as well as any lobbyists that they've hired to lobby on behalf of their country. And so that I also encourage, diving into. I'm going to type it here as well. FARA. So you can dive into that based on country. You can see the total spending, and you can also look up that data and parse it by year.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for that. And those links are in the chat, folks. Just check them out. And again, if you have questions, keep them coming. We will get to them. Just put them in the chat or the Q&A button. And we're talking with Hilary Braseth, the executive director of OpenSecrets. And we have seen money soar in US elections, now billions of dollars. Sometimes there's a perception that it's because we're excited about politics and lots of Americans are making contributions, and they just, we're all getting 100 texts a day from various campaigns asking for money, and it's just small dollar donors. But then I notice the OpenSecrets demographics analysis is often striking how few Americans actually make political contributions of any kind, let alone big ones. Can you take us through, like, is money in politics something that all Americans are participating in, or where does the money come from? Why is it a concern that we have billions of dollars in our elections?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jeff. And this was something that I also had a misperception around heading into this, just by the sheer number, the volume of money entering politics. But it is important to note that the majority of political dollars coming into our elections process, campaigns, et cetera, is coming largely from less than 1% of the population. In other words, and the way that we track it at OpenSecrets is we itemize any gift that's $200 or north of $200 or more. And so in 2024, the percentage of overall giving in the political election cycle this year came from 71% of those $200 or more donations. So those small dollar donations, either like $200 or less, is coming from a little more than a quarter of the population. And so that accounts for overall participants in our political system hovers around 1% of the population. What's important to break down inside of those figures is that if a majority of what we're seeing financially pour into elections comes from a $200 or more donation, means that those who have more means tend to have more influence on the amount of money going into the political election cycle. And so we have as you pointed out, a demographics page that delineates all of those figures. And what's super interesting to note is to dive into not only the percentage of the overall population, but among the givers, what is the breakdown among women and men? It's a very clear trend in the last 10 years. The figures for women, giving more than $200 and having a bigger influence is much higher. There's also a very clear trend with big dollar donors, females giving to one side of the aisle versus the other, and men giving to one side of the aisle or another. And there's also some pretty stark figures when it comes to examining that trend today versus a pre-Citizens United scenario. So just a quick figure that I noted is for $1 million gifts or more, in 2004, just 3 females gave a total of 8.9 million, and just 20 males gave a total of 50 million. And fast forward 20 years later, in this current year, 2024, and we're not even fully at the actual election just yet, 82 females have given a total of 232 million. Now remember, in 2004, it was 8.9 million. And 251 males gave a total of $1.2 billion. And that's just donors who are giving a $1 million plus gift. So the uptick in those big dollar donations has significantly increased this year relative to 2004.
Yeah, so we're at a point where a country of 330 million people has over $1 billion coming from 250 people, plus or minus.
Yeah.
Amazing. Some of those are crypto people. There's a question about crypto spending in the 2024 election. What should we understand about that? I think many of us remember Sam Bankman-Fried. Among his offenses about using the money that didn't belong to him was that he was using it for political influence and spending to influence election outcomes with something of a bipartisan spirit of millions of dollars. What's going on with the crypto spending? Why is there such an interest in that industry?
Such a good question. And we've been getting a lot of inbound questions from reporters along the same line. The way that we see this, and this isn't the first time a trend like this has happened, is that whenever there's a new industry, often you see an uptick in political financial activity, whether that's through lobbying or campaign contributions. And usually it's because that new industry is looking to get a toehold. No industry and often no company wants to be more regulated. So you'll often see an increased political involvement when that industry starts to gain traction financially. You've also seen it with AI, which has had a lot of increase as well in registered lobbyists and spending. We saw it in the past with blue chip companies, social media, and of course, now crypto. And so typically, you have a potential, what's a downside of this is you have a potential for more problems in these cases because these companies and industries tend to be likely less experienced in the sort of foray of politically contributing or lobbying. And so they're more likely to accidentally break the law, as you mentioned, a particular case with a particular company. What's also unique is that crypto's product is money itself. And many people, politicians included, have a hard time probably understanding how that works functionally. So you have a group of people getting lobbied with all of this money who don't necessarily fully understand the industry that they're being advised on how to regulate. And also at the same time, you have an industry that wants to sort of try to get ahead of the curve and influence what those potential parameters around regulation may or may not be. That's, I think, why we've seen such an increase in crypto spending. And you can look at this on our website. We have an industry breakdown as well as a way to dive in and see what they're doing from a lobbying as well as a contributions perspective. And we actually have a specialty crypto issue profile, which has a whole write-up about this in our issue profile section, which we can talk more about too.
Yeah. So this isn't necessarily in the OpenSecrets wheelhouse, but just as it's hard not to note the theory that very smart people, including in crypto and other industries, have, which is you need to spend a lot of money to influence the law in this country. And what does that say for the hundreds of millions of Americans who aren't spending money in politics and don't have money to spend in politics, who obviously are going to be affected by the choices we make about policy, whether it's crypto, healthcare, or anything else. Just a little editorial comment there, Hilary. You don't have to comment on that.
No, I mean, this is a conversation, and I'm also curious to hear your perspective on the matter. But, I had a brief stint in organizing, and I remember the playbook that they gave us was, what moves people in seats of policymaking is either dollars or votes. And so either it's, you influence the political system with money, or you influence the political system with a threshold of people that care about something enough to make that known to folks who sit in positions of decision making. So I think you're absolutely spot on in my view that money talks, and often I was talking with our head lobbying researcher last week, and you look at nearly any sort of trend throughout history, especially in this country. In 2009, there was a big conversation around banning sugary soft drinks like Coca-Cola, for example. And the thrust of that policy was because, as many of us know, those aren't the best for our health. Well, you'll see it in the data for that industry. In 2009, the bar for the amount of money spent on lobbying by the soda industry skyrocketed, and we never got a policy. So often, I think the story gets told or can be viewed in hindsight that, our data, one of the beauties of it is that, again, we have this historical archive. I really view us in many ways as a library, not just a resource that shows in real time, but a library that chronicles the influence of money across the last several decades. Often the way to connect the dots in politics is indeed following the money.
Yeah, and you raised an interesting point about the sugar and soft drink industry story. There's been many of those examples, it seems to me, where the frustration of the citizenry about the lawmaking process has led to, at least in those states that have a ballot initiative, an effort to bring it directly to the people under the citizen ballot initiative. But of course, the money now has moved that direction too, with hundreds of millions of dollars spent in some ballot initiatives. In Maine, foreign government-owned corporations and other states, foreign government-owned corporations spending money to influence the outcome of ballot initiatives. Do you track that? Do you track ballot initiatives? I just
100%.
see you sure do, because you just put it in the chat. Say,
I'm following.
You're getting ahead of me, Hilary.
In real time.
That's the question.
Honestly, this is one of my favorite parts about what we do, in that, you can click on virtually any state and see the top ballot initiatives that are at play, and see specifically who's funding either side of that issue. So advocacy groups, activists, this is an incredibly valuable resource for the sake of whatever side of the issue they're trying to work toward. But you're absolutely right. I think states in general are becoming the new frontier of political activity, from ballot measures to folks running for office. I know in some states, judicial Supreme Court ships are actually elected. And so in those cases, you've seen campaign contributions to somebody running for a Supreme Court seat. And so, there's influence there for folks that receive campaign contributions to be a judge. So I think increasingly we're seeing a trend toward decentralization. So increasingly understanding what's happening in money and politics at the state level is really critical. And I think in our case, we're really excited. We're in the midst of a pretty big data integration project internally, where on the other side of that, hopefully sometime next year, we'll be able to see at a glance all things state money and politics alongside federal, and the amount of insights and trends and patterning that we'll be able to see across states. What donors are donating in which states? Do we see a pattern for even activity along the lines of election denial, no matter who wins or who loses, and certain funders who are backing those folks? There's a lot that you'll be able to do with regard to our data set on the other side of that big initiative.
Yeah, and it sounds like that might speak to Nancy Morgan's question in the chat, which I'll just bring forward, about integration of the old follow the money state data that you have absorbed. Is that what you're talking about? This integration will integrate all of that state spending data?
Absolutely, Nancy. You are spot on to ask that. And yes, that's our big data integration project. So for those of you who don't know, in 2021, we merged, there were two organizations that merged together to form us, OpenSecrets as it is today. And one was followthemoney.org, and the other was OpenSecrets.org, which is all federal data. And so we're in the midst of making sure that all of that data is integrated on our back end. And hopefully sometime next year, you'll be able to do a lot more analysis as a result of that finally being integrated.
Great. Well, I want to make sure we get to some questions, but just a couple more on OpenSecrets, and then we'll open it up. So please put your questions in the chat or the Q&A. But Hilary, tell us about the impact of OpenSecrets. What's important for the takeaway?
Yeah, I think the takeaway for us, for the work that we do, is really we're the only source for all of this information on money and politics. And I share that only because, in a context where I think everyone is hyper-focused on a partisan outcome for an election, the infrastructure underpinning our democracy, transparency, the ability to sort of be the motor behind a lot of other pro-democracy efforts, transparency is a huge key in that. And so we have 7 million unique users come to our website every year. And in a presidential election cycle, that swells to about 10 million. So in our view, it's clear that whether it's an organization like American Promise or other folks who are acting in favor of, democracy and accountability, like journalists, for example, we do really feel that it's clear our data is quite necessary for a lot of those activities.
Yeah, well, as I said, it's invaluable to us at American Promise, and I'm sure many more. I've heard something, but I hope you'll share something about the new OpenSecrets Issue Center. What can you tell us about that now?
Yeah, I can send you a link to that as well. That is an initiative that we started about a year and a half ago, where we decided that it would be helpful if we could start to analyze our data in the context of issues, really hot button issues. And so that includes, climate change, as I mentioned, cryptocurrency, guns. At the time, COVID-19 was a big, lobbying issue that we covered as well, electronic cigarettes. So we have a whole center with these issues, and within each issue profile, we dive into the data around lobbying patterns and also campaign contributions around those issues. So you can take a look at the link that I just shared in the chat here. And our hope is to continue with those into the coming years. And also, if anybody has an issue that they want us to do an analysis on, that's something that we would be more than happy and excited to do a collaboration around.
Excellent. All right, well, let's open it up to some questions. There's a lot of them coming in the chat. I might take the first one, if you don't mind. It's from my friend Mac Regan, and he says, does Congress have the legislative power to overcome Citizens United by establishing laws that limit contributions to only individuals and only up to specified limits, such as in Canada? Mac, the reason I wanted to take that question is because that is the very reason for American Promise's existence, which is the answer is no. Congress does not have the legislative power now to establish laws that limit contributions to individuals and only to specified limits. The Supreme Court's decisions in Citizens United and back to Buckley versus Vallejo ruled that while they can do that for specific contributions that go straight to candidates' campaigns, independent spending, i.e. the super PACs or other sources of independent spending, cannot be limited in that way, whether it's corporations, unions, other entities, and cannot be limited in amount. That is not what the First Amendment meant for the first 200 years of American history. It's not what Americans want it to mean. Americans have always wanted laws that limit the power of money in our elections. And so that's why we need a constitutional amendment. Congress, in our view, does have that power. The Supreme Court has just made a misinterpretation of the First Amendment to deprive Congress and the states, for that matter, and the people of that power. Our amendment allows us to get it back. So that will fix that problem. But thank you for the question. Hilary, I don't know, it's not a data question, so I don't know if you want to touch that one, but it is, I think that those Supreme Court decisions are behind the explosive growth in the billions of dollars that you've been documenting over these past years.
You can see it pretty clearly in the money, and especially in our outside spending data, which I'll post in the chat as well. You can see a pretty clear spike in donations. The chart that I just shared in the chat essentially shows where we are at in this current cycle across all historical years. And you can see already this year, we're tracking nearly double in outside spending compared to 2020. And that outside spending is largely the money that comes in from those mega donors.
Yeah. Okay. Ann Drum in Texas asked, do you survey lawmakers to find out about how much time they spend doing call time? And I'll just say that some of the context of that is some lawmakers have told us is up to 70% of their time is now spent raising money or trying to raise money rather than lawmaking. Do you ever get any information about that, Hilary, at OpenSecrets?
It's a great question. We don't gather data ourselves, but I also know, I believe Issue One, which is another organization in the space, has done some pretty heavy surveying of members of Congress. And I've seen the figure, closer to even 85% to 90% of members of Congress time.
Amazing.
I mean, I know Jeff, Dean is on your board, right? Dean Phillips.
Dean Phillips speaks at our conference regularly,
Yes.
and he's still a member of Congress. So until he steps down in January, but he's a good friend of American Promise. Yes. And
I'm sorry to bring him up, but I do remember
no,
him also
it's
saying that
wonderful.
this is
Yeah.
largely how members of Congress are forced to spend their time by virtue of the realities of the role.
Yeah, and Dean Phillips, Minnesota congressman, spoke at our conference that Hillary's referring to, and was remarkably frank about the problem of how much time they're spending raising money, and so that thank you for flagging that. Let's go to some other questions. There's I'm scrolling through because we have more. Oh, here's a quick one we can knock off for you, Hilary. Your annual budget at OpenSecrets.
Yeah, that's a great question. Our annual budget is around 5 million US dollars. And historically, a majority of that has come from large institutional foundations, around 85 to 90%. That, of course, is shifting with institutional foundations that are interested in other issues, and especially in this election cycle with a partisan outcome in many cases. So we are also, as an organization, quickly identifying other strategies to make sure that we can keep the doors open and supplying you all the data.
Great. And so Peter Hornbeck asks, like, is there anyone who opposes you? Do you have like organizations or people challenging your credibility or your bias, or do you have opposition like that?
You know, it's a good question. I think at times we get folks reaching out actually on behalf of a client because they notice that their client's name pops up in our donor database. So for example, if somebody's trying to eradicate their presence on the internet or kind of keep a certain reputation, they might reach out suggesting like, you know, this information needs to be removed from your site. But in the instance where it's legitimate and supposed to be there by law, we don't, in all cases, necessarily do much about that unless there's a real rationale. And then in terms of sort of overarching political bent or what have you, we sometimes get accused of leaning toward one side or the other of the aisle, but often as soon as we engage in that conversation, it's usually evaporated by virtue of us showing quite explicitly how we have, as I mentioned earlier, dirt on both sides of the aisle. And so I think in some ways, both sides appreciate us because it helps them in their sort of attempts to make sure that they're running their political campaigns in ways that may turn out with a win, and vice versa. So we generally, yes, but also not as much as I frankly thought that we would before I joined. And hopefully it stays that way, just with some more challenging moments that our political infrastructure is enduring.
Yeah. And Jim Reeser has asked a couple of questions. Some of them might be legal. And we have had Trevor Potter at the Campaign Legal Center on this leadership conversation before, and he would know all the answers to the legal ins and outs, but we'll do our best, Jim. So let's fire away. When a member of Congress retires, where does the campaign fund go?
Oh, such a good question.
Yeah.
My understanding is that the FEC has pretty, strict rules and guides for where the money can go. So in other words, the member can't simply just pocket the money if that's a question. One avenue that sometimes happens is that the committee can give money to another committee, subject to the usual limits. And also what sometimes happens is this term we call a zombie committee, which is basically a member might just simply keep the committee up and running, whether that means they may want to run for office again and they can use that funding down the line, or they haven't decided where they might want to direct that through to other committees instead. But the FEC does have guidelines on that, and I can share that as well.
Okay, great. All right, I want to make sure we're staying on time. Thank you for all your questions. If we'll get to more, if we have time. But Hilary, let me go back to the presidential cycle. I know there's 19,000 communities in this country and elections in most of them, so it's not certainly not the only election, but it's on a lot of people's minds. And of course, the federal elections and the statewide elections are all coming up in 40 days. The money is pouring in. in all of those, what are you focusing on between now and November versus your usual year in, day, month in, week out kind of work? What's
Yeah,
the next 40 days look like for you?
it's a great question. The volume is increasing. So every month, we're processing a lot of the federal deadlines, and every week, subject to how each state does it, we're processing the states as well. There are several sort of election specific products or projects that we take on. As I mentioned earlier in the call, one of the things that we're pretty well known for is calculating the total cost of the election. And so that's something that we, factor in a whole host of different data points to sort of round out on a singular figure and have an ability to sort of drill into that a bit more deeply. Another analysis that's interesting that we run, as I mentioned earlier, is did money win? And so we analyze a lot of this data in relationship to the actual outcome of the election to discern whether or not money may or may not have had an influence on those races. So I'm going to share a link to that in here. And as you can probably tell, it's often, in the higher percents that the candidates who raised money also or had the top spending also won the election in their district. And then we also, around the election, often do race and gender analyses. We are unique in that we manually collect identifying information for candidates at the federal level. And so we'll also do some analyses around how money's patterns relate to identity characteristics of those running for office. And so we usually do that in partnership with an academic institution as well. So that's a big initiative. In addition to what I mentioned earlier of this big data integration project that will be really exciting once we finish it into next year, and also a really exciting potential update to our website that we're hoping is live right before the election to make it a lot easier for all of you to dive into the data and to begin to discover for yourselves.
Yeah. Are you able to track where the money is spent? So if it's going into advertising, it's going to digital versus TV, it's going to something else, how granular can you get on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we at least categorize based on what it's spent on. So if you go to any political candidate, and I can pull that up just one second. For example, here is Kamala Harris's page. So not only do we show the fundraising totals, but we also show the source of those funds. And we also have expenditures. So we have expenditures and independent expenditures, and I'll paste this here as well, which shows at a categorical level what is going into media versus, consultants on consultants. There's always so many consultants involved in these races. And so you can see at a categorical level what those expenditures are. And then we also track independent expenditures, as I mentioned, which are, you mentioned Future Forward USA. You'll see that as well in Kamala Harris's profile, for example. And the same goes for Donald Trump. We have the same data on expenditures, et cetera, for him.
Yeah. Could you define independent expenditure? That's a question that's in the chat.
Yeah, independent expenditure is largely related to the term super PAC as well. So essentially, post Citizens United, it's sort of created this genesis of an outside spending entity where people could donate unlimited amounts to that outside entity. And then that outside entity could spend on behalf of a candidate insofar as there's no coordination between that group and the candidate. Now, insofar as is with a big number of asterisks, because as we know, it's not perfect and there could potentially be some coordination that's happening. But that independent expenditure line item refers to instances where that outside third party is getting all this money in and being able to spend all this money out on behalf of a candidate. And so it's really this like unique and very large pool of money that really blossoms the amount of total money that we see in elections. And in fact, that's the figure that's, already tracking to be nearly double what we were seeing in 2020 at this time during that election cycle. What's also interesting to note is that for the first time in at least what we can recall, the top sort of mega donors, because often that's the vehicle through which mega donors donate to, is those independent expenditure groups. The top 5 of those donors are all Republican. And historically, there's been more skew in the top 5. Out of the top 10, 6 of them are Republican and 4 are Democratic. But that top 5 that's a new trend that we haven't seen before.
Do you have any theory about that, or is it just you report and we decide?
It's a great question. And I was, chatting about this with one of our researchers earlier. One reason could be that, I mean, in the Republican case too, there wasn't really a strong primary, but in the Democratic case, there wasn't any primary. And so there could be some rationale there by virtue of the Republicans having had a primary. So there's one reason there. Another one could be that, with the switch of Kamala to be the lead candidate, there was a different energetic, profile for perhaps mega donors giving to Democrats prior to that transition. Since the transition of Kamala, we have seen in the last 2 months that she's brought in the hundreds of millions per month. And so we could see those top 5 shift with time.
Yeah.
In fact, that could happen in the next few days because we're in the midst of processing a download now. So you should see an update to our site in the next several days with the new figures.
So stay tuned. And on mega donors, just to underline this, we're not talking about maxing out, at $3,300 or something. We're talking about those 5 donors doing hundreds of millions of dollars, 5 individuals. Is that right?
Yeah. And sorry for all the links, but I just pasted another link in the chat, and you're absolutely right. We're talking in the hundreds of millions to double-digit millions of dollars given to the candidates. And it's names that you wouldn't necessarily immediately recognize, but are, relatively well known in the sort of political circles. So yeah, you're exactly right.
And we're running out of time, and I want to make sure we get a question in that Senator Jim Rubens, and former New Hampshire state senator, serves on the American Promise board. He's put a number of questions in, but they all circle around something we see all the time at American Promise, because we're in states all over the country. And, bringing it back to something I said at the top, which is Americans are desperately looking for a solution. They're putting this at the number 3 issue behind the economy and terrorism. And why is that? And I think what we've seen, Hilary, and I want to ask you about this, is this money is now going into states, and many of the donors are actually from a few zip codes, relatively speaking, and they're often metropolitan zip codes pouring into rural states that and so you're having this outside money, not just in the legal sense of outside money, but outside the state, outside the community, dominating the airwaves. We've heard complaints all the time of one of our folks in Maine talking about during the $200 million Senate race, Maine organizations could not buy airtime. It was all bought up by the national super PAC. So this literally silencing of local voices and domination of themes and message and attacks from a nationalized strategy run by a few donors and consultants, relatively speaking. Is that what your data reflects as well, that experience of what people are telling us?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as I mentioned, it's a bit harder to see at a glance simply because of the, the technological limitations at present. But where you can see that is, again, as I mentioned, the ballot measures. And if you dig into the data at the state level on our followthemoney.org site, you can similarly see the same. In the case of the ballot measures, I'll share a quick anecdote that one of our team members lives in Ohio, and she was saying when there was a pretty hot button ballot measure on her ballot in the last year, that when she dug into the donors for that ballot measure, she identified that a lot, if not most of the money, was coming from out of state. And she was saying, it's shocking to be living in this state and to realize that, you know, a lot of the campaigns around these initiatives have nothing to do with those who are from the state. So you're spot on. I think we're seeing the same trend in our data. And you see it also at the level of members of Congress and others who run for office at the state level. With social media getting, you know, that national platform, it's a lot easier for folks running for office to garner that publicity and draw in dollars from out of state or out of jurisdiction. And, you know, there's a big debate in this very niche money and politics community on whether or not that's a good thing, whether it perverts this notion of representation or not, or if it instead, you know, is free competition. But yeah, you're spot on. It's what the data shows.
Okay, well, I have not heard too many people say it's a good thing, but I guess I'm not as niche as some others in this movement, because that's not what we hear out in the. No, I haven't heard anybody say we want more money in politics and we want more of it from outside our state and we want more of it concentrated among billionaires. But you know, this is America with lots of views. So
Yeah.
Hilary, thank you so much. We're running out of time here. Don't worry, all the links, folks, in the chat, we're going to follow up with a email to everybody. You'll get those links even after we sign off, and you'll find that and more on OpenSecrets.org. So be sure to check it out. Spread the word about what a useful tool this is for all Americans and organizations and journalists. And of course, spread the word about American Promise at americanpromise.net. This is something that we can bring to every American and continue this conversation. Knowledge certainly helps the citizenry govern ourselves, and Open Secrets is such an important part of that knowledge base. So Hilary, thank you so much. We really enjoyed the conversation and grateful for all the work and you and all your team at Open Secrets does.
Thank you so much, Jeff. This is a delight of a conversation, and thank you all of you for tuning in and diving into the data. Greatly appreciate it.
All right. Take care, everybody. We'll see you on the next leadership series and out talking to your fellow Americans about amending the Constitution to solve the money in politics problem. All right, folks, have a good night.